In 1888, Jack the Ripper killed 5 women and stopped the world. 15 years earlier, at an inn in Kansas, a single family had already killed twice as many, with a curtain, a hammer, and an orchard. You've never seen a movie about them. These are the 20 serial killers the Old West produced, hid, and filed away. Number 1. In 1871, a family arrived in Labette County, Kansas, and opened an inn along the trail that took settlers west. John, Elvira, John Jr., and Kate Bender sold meals and beds. It looked like just another roadside stop. It wasn't. The house had a room divided by a canvas curtain. The guest was seated at the table with their back to it. On the other side, someone waited with a hammer. After the blow, the guest's throat was cut, and the body dropped through a trap door into the basement. Later, it was buried in the orchard. It went on for 2 years. In 1873, Dr. William York stopped there while looking for a missing neighbor and never came back. His brother, a colonel, started asking questions. By the time he got to the inn, the Benders were already gone. At least 11 bodies were found in the orchard. An armed group went after the family. They came back empty-handed, with stories that didn't match. Some swore the Benders had been caught and killed. Others said they escaped. None of them were ever put on trial. What we know for sure ends right there, at the door of that house. Number 2. Kate Bender, the public face. While the rest of the family stayed by the road, she traveled through nearby towns. Ads in Kansas newspapers promoted Professor Miss Katie Bender, claiming she could cure deafness, blindness, and illnesses that doctors had given up trying to treat. She gave lectures on spiritualism in Parsons and Cherryvale, drew paying crowds, and came home with a list of people who were sick, lonely, and willing to travel. That was where the business began. Among those who trusted her were Benjamin Brown, Henry Mackenzie, and George Launcher, who arrived with his young daughter. How much did Kate do with her own hands? No one knows for sure. Statements from neighbors described her sometimes as the mastermind behind the operation, and other times as a young woman following old man Bender's orders. The records don't settle that question. What newspapers in 1873 couldn't wrap their heads around was something else: a young, beautiful, religious woman being used as bait. It turned the script of the time upside down, and panic spread across the country. Record: at least 11 documented victims, 1871 to 1873, whereabouts unknown. Number 3. Alfred Packer, February 1874, San Juan Mountains, Colorado. 6 men head into the snow looking for gold. 2 months later, only one comes out: Alfred Packer. He's well-fed, has money in his pocket, and is carrying a knife that wasn't his. The other 5, Israel Swan, George Noon, Frank Miller, James Humphrey, and Shannon Bell, never came back. Packer told the story 3 times, and each version was different. First, the group split up. Then, the men starved to death one by one, and the survivors ate the dead. Finally, Bell went crazy, killed the others, and Packer killed him in self-defense. He was convicted in 1883 and again in 1886. So, what's the truth? Cannibalism to survive, or a man who saw 5 easy victims? In 1989, a forensic team exhumed the bodies. They found signs of blows to the head and defensive wounds on the arms. Someone fought back. That weakens the starvation story, but it doesn't settle the question. A 1994 study of the weapon found at the site gave some support to the self-defense story. Packer died a free man in 1907, and the mystery stayed in the mountains. Number 4. Levi Boone Helm. If Packer leaves room for doubt, Helm leaves none. Born in Kentucky in 1828, he started early. In 1851, in Missouri, he stabbed his friend Littleberry Shute to death just because the young man backed out of traveling west with him. From then on, traveling with Boone Helm meant gambling with your life. In the winter of 1853, while crossing the Oregon mountains, his group ran out of food. One by one, his companions disappeared. Helm made it to the end of the journey and calmly said that he had eaten the flesh of one of them. It wasn't the last time he admitted it, and never with any regret. In Montana, he joined Henry Plummer's gang. When the Virginia City vigilantes arrested him in January 1864, men who had seen it all were shocked by how cold he was. Helm didn't deny it and didn't ask for forgiveness. On the gallows, he shouted, "Long live Jeff Davis," and told them to pull the rope. And here's the lesson. Packer may have killed out of hunger. Helm killed out of habit. That's the difference between a desperate man and a predator. Number 5. Imagine the most respected man in your town. He doesn't drink, doesn't smoke, doesn't gamble, and never misses Sunday church. Now imagine that same man gets paid to kill. That was James Brown Miller, Deacon Jim, born in Arkansas in 1861. His first recorded case dates back to 1884. His brother-in-law, John Coop, shot while he slept. Miller was convicted but walked free on appeal. From then on, he worked as a sheriff, a hired gun, and, according to many historians, the West's first professional hitman. He worked from ambush, using a shotgun, and made it back in time for the sermon. How many victims? No one knows. Records point to at least 14. Estimates go as high as 40, and he himself reportedly claimed even more. To this day, people still debate whether he was the one who killed Pat Garrett in 1908. His last contract was Gus Bobbitt, a farmer from Ada, Oklahoma, killed in February 1909. In April, a mob dragged Miller out of jail and hanged him in a barn along with 3 accomplices. The photo of the bodies spread across the country. The lesson is this: the most trusted man in town was also its deadliest product. Number 6. Tom Horn. In 1903, in Cheyenne, Wyoming, a man went to the gallows for killing a 14-year-old boy. What almost no one talks about is who was signing his checks. Tom Horn had been an Army scout in the Apache Wars, a Pinkerton detective, and eventually a hired gun for Wyoming's big cattle companies. The job was simple. Get rid of anyone the cattle barons called a rustler, which in practice meant small farmers who fenced off grazing land. Horn shot from a distance with a rifle and often left a rock under the dead man's head. Records point to William Lewis and Fred Powell in 1895 and Matt Rash and Isom Dart in 1900. No one was arrested. The price, according to witnesses, was $500 a head. Then came Willie Nickel, killed in July 1901 near Iron Mountain. Horn was convicted based on a confession he made while drunk to Agent Joe LaForce, recorded by a stenographer. To this day, people still debate whether he was telling the truth. Hanged on November 20th, 1903. None of his employers was even indicted. Documented victims, 4 to 5. Number 7. 3 years before Jack the Ripper, a city in Texas was already living through that nightmare. Between December 1884 and Christmas 1885, Austin saw a series of nighttime attacks inside people's homes. Molly Smith was the first. Then came Eliza Shelley, Irene Cross, Mary Ramey, who was only 11 years old, and Gracie Vance, killed along with Orange Washington. They were all black and worked as domestic servants. The city barely reacted. That only changed on Christmas Eve, when Susan Hancock and Eula Phillips, white women from wealthy neighborhoods, were killed on the same night. That's when the police finally took action, arrested dozens of suspects, and convicted no one for the crimes. In February 1886, a cook named Nathan Elgin was shot by police while attacking a woman. The murders stopped. Proof that he was the killer? None. Years later, newspapers suggested that the killer may have gone to London. It's a theory, not a fact. What remains is this: Austin had its own Ripper 3 years before London and forgot about it because the first victims were invisible. Number 8. Stephen D. Richards. He was 22 years old and had the kind of face nobody noticed. In Nebraska, between 1876 and 1878, that was enough for him to kill 9 people without anyone connecting the dots. Richards went from farm to farm asking for a place to stay. In December 1878, near Kearney, he stayed at the home of Mary Harrelson, a widow with 3 young children. Days later, the entire family was dead, and he was living on the land as if it were his. Weeks earlier, he had killed Peter Anderson, a neighbor, over a debt of just a few dollars. When police caught up with him in Ohio in January 1879, he didn't resist. He confessed each case to reporters with the calm of someone reading the weather forecast. One of them wrote that Richards talked about deaths the way other people talked about crops. The motive was so small that the crime seemed to have none at all. A century later, medicine would have a name for it: psychopathy. On April 26, 1879, he was hanged in Minden in front of a crowd that had traveled from far away just to see if he would flinch. He didn't. Documented victims, 9. Number 9. Before the Old West even existed, the pattern was already there. In 1797, 2 brothers named Makaja and Wiley Harp, known as Big and Little Harp, began crossing the frontier between Kentucky and Tennessee, killing travelers along the road. It wasn't for money. They admitted themselves that they killed because they enjoyed it. The bodies were weighted down with rocks and sunk in rivers so they wouldn't be found. Among the documented victims were Thomas Langford, a young traveler, 13-year-old John Trabue, and Mary Stiegel with her infant son. Records point to between 20 and 40 people killed in 2 years, at a time when there was barely any law in the area. In August 1799, a group of settlers caught up with Big Harp in Kentucky. His head was nailed to a tree at a crossroads as a warning, and the place is still known as Harp's Head to this day. Little Harp escaped and wasn't hanged until 1804 in Mississippi. Historians call them America's first recorded serial killers. The West didn't create this kind of man. It simply inherited him. Number 10. A lot of people think the Benders were a one-of-a-kind case. They weren't. Regional stories and scattered records point to other inns along isolated routes where travelers went in and never came out. The setup was always the same. Picture a man who sold his cattle, put the money in his pocket, and hit the road alone. Between one town and the next were days of travel, with no telegraph and no sheriff nearby. A house with a light on and a plate of food was the only shelter around. No one knew he had stopped there. If he disappeared, his family, weeks away, might not find out until months later. And the explanation was already waiting. A flooded river, Indians, cold weather, bandits on the trail. The road took the blame. Add to that the jurisdiction problem we've already seen. A county that didn't know where its borders ended, a territory without firmly established law, an innkeeper who was also the local justice of the peace. The crime didn't have to be done well, it just needed a place where no one would look. How many of these houses existed, there's no way to know for sure. What we do know is what happened when someone decided to dig. The next case shows exactly that. Number 11. Charles Kennedy, the tavern keeper on the Taos Trail. Fall of 1870, Elizabethtown, New Mexico. A woman comes running barefoot in the middle of the night. She says her husband kills guests at his own tavern. His name is Charles Kennedy. The house sat along the trail between Elizabethtown and Taos, a route miners carrying gold had to take. A traveler would stop there alone, eat, sleep, and never be seen again. When the men from town went there, they found buried bones and burned bones in the fireplace. How many victims? The records don't say. No one wrote down their names, people passing through with no family nearby, and no one looking for them. Kennedy was arrested, but there was no trial. A mob, reportedly led by Clay Allison according to local tradition, dragged him out of his cell and hanged him. No one was punished for it. The story that his head was cut off and displayed in a bar in Cimarron is a legend, and records from the time don't confirm it. The detail that sticks with you: the cycle only ended because his wife escaped. Without her, how many more years would that door have stayed open? Number 12. Kansas City, 1909. The richest family in the city starts dying inside their own home. First, old Thomas Swope, the millionaire who donated the park that still bears his name today. Then his cousin James Hunton. Then his nephew Chrisman. Within a few weeks, a typhoid fever outbreak strikes 5 more members of the family. And who's taking care of all of them? The family's son-in-law, Dr. Bennett Clark Hyde. A respected man, married to the heiress, always nearby, always carrying his medical bag. When the bodies were exhumed, the report found strychnine and cyanide. The accusation: he was clearing the way to the fortune. Hyde was sentenced to life in prison in 1910, but the story doesn't end there. The Missouri Supreme Court overturned the verdict. 2 new trials ended without a decision. In 1917, the case was dropped. He died a free man in 1934 without ever confessing. To this day, no one can say for sure whether he was a killer or a scapegoat. The lesson is this: on the frontier, the serial killer's most discreet weapon wasn't the revolver. It was hospitality. Number 13. Now comes the part nobody puts on a gravestone. Between 1850 and 1890, no county in the West kept track of who headed out on the trail and never made it to the other side. A man would sell his farm in Missouri, load up his wagon, and disappear before reaching Colorado. His family waited for a letter. The letter never came. And then what? Nothing. No body, no sheriff, no investigation. No one opened a case. No one went looking. The sheriff of one county didn't cross into the next one, and nobody had a telegraph to ask around. Think about what that meant for a man with bad intentions. Travelers passing through, carrying cash, far from any relatives, in a place where disappearing was normal. Historians today admit there's no reliable number for how many vanished that way. Some researchers talk about thousands. It could be fewer, it could be far more. The point isn't the number. The point is the system. The frontier was tailor-made for anyone who killed and kept moving. The cases you're about to see are the ones that left a trail. Ask yourself, how many didn't? Number 14. In January 1864, the vigilantes of Virginia City, Montana, hanged 5 men in a single morning. One of them was Boone Helm. The official charge: highway robbery. But the records point to something else. Helm had already killed a man in Missouri in 1851 and bragged about eating part of a companion during a winter in Oregon. Neither case was ever tried. The committee hanged him for robbing stagecoaches, and only later did the stories reveal who he really was. Here's the disturbing part. The vigilantes got it right, but not because they investigated. They got it right because they went after anything that moved. Weeks later, they hanged Jack Slade, and his crime was drinking and causing trouble in town. It's worth remembering that almost everything we know about Helm comes from Thomas Dimsdale, a journalist who wrote in defense of the committee. So, take the numbers with caution. The lesson doesn't change. A system that gets things right blindly is wrong by definition. It just doesn't record the mistakes. Getting Helm right went down in history. The mistakes became unmarked graves. Number 15. Now, pay attention to something that changes the game. Until the late 1800s, every murder in the West was treated as an isolated case. A body in Colorado and another in California? Nobody connected the dots. And the killers knew it. Around the turn of the century, that started to change. The telegraph, bulletins shared between departments, and the first detective agencies began comparing methods, victim types, and routes. It was the beginning of what would later be called criminal profiling. One example where connecting the cases worked was Earl Nelson in the 1920s. He killed boarding house landladies along the West Coast, from San Francisco to Portland and Seattle, always in the same way and always while on the move. The count passed 20 documented victims. A description of the suspect circulated between cities, and he was eventually arrested in Canada in 1927. One warning is worth keeping in mind. Historians still debate how much of that was real coordination and how much was luck. But the principle stuck. The West taught America that some killers don't stop. The lesson cost decades of victims. Number 16. Think about how many Westerns you've seen. Hundreds, maybe. Now try to remember a single one that showed a serial killer. Not a hired gun, not a gang robbing a train. I'm talking about the guy who rented rooms to travelers and buried the guests in the backyard. Hollywood made thousands of Westerns throughout the 20th century and barely touched this. It wasn't an oversight. It was a choice. Movie Westerns sold a simple idea. Danger came at you head-on, with a warning at high noon on the main street. You drew faster or you died. The cases in this video tell a different story. The Benders served coffee before they killed. Stephen Richards passed himself off as a trustworthy ranch hand. The real danger didn't challenge anyone to a duel. It offered a bed and a hot meal. Putting that on screen would have destroyed the myth of the honorable man who solves everything with courage and a gun. The studios preferred the villain you could see coming from a mile away. What the movies left out was exactly what the victims' families came to know up close. Number 17. The Hunt for the Benders. We're back in Kansas, but now for what came after. Governor Thomas Osborne offered $2,000 for all 4 of them, and detectives and bounty hunters went looking across the entire country. No one collected a single cent. In 1889, Leroy Dick, who had led the search in 1873, traveled to Michigan and identified 2 women, Almira Monroe and Sarah Eliza Davis, as the Bender mother and daughter. They were arrested, taken to Kansas, and questioned in a Labette courtroom. Former neighbors swore they recognized them. Others swore they didn't. Records showed that one of the women was registered somewhere else at the time of the crimes. In 1890, both women walked free. Years later, when they were old, some of the men from the 1873 search broke their silence and separately claimed that the family had been caught and killed on the same night. No bodies, no records, no names of who pulled the trigger. So both possibilities carry the same weight. They escaped for good, or they were executed and buried outside the record. The most famous case in this video ends the same way it began, with a curtain. Number 18. Put all 17 files on the table, and the pattern shows up on its own. Every case had a road with no witnesses, a victim no one expected to come back, and a sheriff whose map ended at the county line. Cattle trails, mining camps, stagecoach stops, places where a man could disappear, and the easiest explanation was the distance itself. Newspapers covered what sold. A dead settler made headlines. A Chinese man, a cowboy with no family, or a prostitute got a single line at the bottom of the page, if they got one at all. With no telegraph between sheriff's offices and no central records, no one added up the bodies. We can add them up now, with the usual warning. The documented cases alone add up to more than 100 victims, estimates more than double that. Even the lower number is more terrifying than any saloon legend. The territory only saw the pattern when it arrived fully formed from London, with a name, a nickname, and letters to the editor. Jack the Ripper defined the century. The West had dozens like him and filed almost all of them away. This video is pulling those files back out.